Alright, welcome back, guys. So in this video, we're now going to move on and talk about the next principle that I wanted to talk about. We kind of went over it in the last video, but there is a little bit that's still important that we didn't talk about, so we're going to talk about it now. I also want to say in the last video, I noticed a glare in the board. I obviously can't tell when I'm recording that it's there. And as you can probably tell, I'm not really that good with all this tech stuff and recording and things like that and camera. I'm just here, I pretty much just set all this up super amateurish to try to get these videos out there, right? So hopefully this looks a little bit better. It looks kind of weird to me, but maybe on camera it's not so bad, so we'll see. But yeah, I just wanted to basically say I'm aware that I think other videos were too, but it was pretty bad last video. So anyway, so now we're going to go over what I call the reflection principle. So to understand that principle, we're going to look at this idea right here. So the mind has a tendency to try to make sense of its surroundings, which, giving it a lot of attention as a result. So basically, what I'm basically saying there is that when you focus on, let's say you're observing something in the external world, so not in your mind, not in your imagination, you're observing something in the outside environment. Right, the act of observing something causes you to produce intentions to kind of try to make sense of what's happening and to understand it, right? So if you see, if you see a car driving by, right, you have a tendency. It's hard for you to resist, right, the urge to produce an intention to think about that car and the fact that it's driving by, right? So very simple. Your conscious mind basically has a tendency to imitate or copy what you're observing. And I'll get to this principle in a moment. But, and that basically comes from the fact that what we spoke about last video, you can't think something without giving some of your attention toward the thing you're thinking about. You have to put some of your attention on it. So, let's say you're walking down the street and there are cars on the road, right? You need to make sure you cross the street when there's no cars, right? If you have to cross the street. And you're not going to be able to do that very well, right? If some of your attention, a good chunk of your attention, isn't on the road, isn't on the cars, it isn't on the idea of when to cross, and if now's a good time to cross, right? So your attention has to be given to all those ideas in order to successfully cross the street. If you don't give your attention to those ideas, then you can't think about it. And so there's pretty much no way to safely cross the street without thinking about what's going on. And so we have a tendency as we go about our day to constantly think about what's going on in our environment around us in order to make sense of it, in order to interact with our environment safely, and so that we're not in danger. But once again, I'll reiterate, you can't think about your environment or process thoughts related to it without giving your attention to the environment and the thoughts and ideas that you're considering, right? So, in order to, once again, simply interact with your environment and be in your environment safely, your conscious mind has to be thinking about the environment it's perceiving. So if you're, like I said, if you see a car driving by, you're going to have a tendency to produce an intention that compels your subconscious and alters your perception to see a car driving by. If you hear a loud sound, right, you're going to produce an intention which alters your perception to perceive a loud sound and so on. Now, to be clear, yes, your body is feeding sensory information through your subconscious, right? So it's routed through your subconscious and to your conscious mind. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about the machinery of that when we get into psychic abilities in chapter 7 of book 2. However, because there's a lot to explain about that, I know that might seem a little bit like a loaded sort of framework to just say the sensory information from the body is routed through the subconscious into the conscious mind, but we go much more in detail into that in chapter 7 of book 2. But anyway, so information is being routed from the body through the subconscious to the conscious mind. However, the conscious mind still has the ability, it's harder, but it still has the ability to just tune out whatever sensory information the body's feeding to it. So it doesn't necessarily have to give a lot of its attention toward what you're physically sensing, right? So, for For example, if I'm daydreaming and I'm walking, I might bump into something, right? Because my attention isn't on the like where I'm walking and the environment I'm walking in, how close I am to things like that. Even though physically I still see it, my attention isn't on it. It's on other things in my mind. So I can't think about not bumping into the whatever I bumped into without drawing my attention to it. Because attention is finity or finite, then I would have to give less of it to my mind and more of it to the environment. So even though your body's feeding you sensory information, you still have to draw your attention to the environment too in order to make sense of it and interact with it properly. So that basically, all that comes to this principle. So basically what I call the reflection principle. So we kind of already said it, but this is the tendency of the conscious mind to produce an intention that reflects or copies the context of what it's observing. So like I said, we kind of ran over most of it, but what do I mean by the context? Well, the context is basically incorporates the three command components. It's really two. It's really two of the command components. I don't know so much about the desire component. But anyway, so we said that your intention has three command components: desire, concrete, and abstract, right? So the concrete represents the physical parameters of your intention, or it's when your intention's command expresses physical dimension, or it expresses itself in a way that could be represented by something your five senses could recognize. And then the abstract component is mainly information, right? Often in the form of relationships. So when you are focused on the environment around you, like I said, you have a tendency to try to make sense of it. So in order to make sense of it, your conscious mind is constantly producing a command component that copies what you think is happening. So the concrete component generally is given for free by your five senses. So you have a tendency to just copy whatever your five senses are feeding you in your intention. Now, that might seem a little strange, but I believe that is what's happening. So in other words, if I'm looking at a car, right, in my imagination, my perception's also altered to imagine a car, right? It doesn't need to do that, right? Because technically, my body's feeding information to my sensory experience. What I'm imagining is not actually what I'm seeing in the physical reality. What I'm seeing in the physical reality is coming from my body. However, your mind still copies it anyway. So what's usually happening is I'm seeing something in the physical reality through my five senses, but I'm also seeing it in my mind at the same time as a result of this reflection principle. Now, you don't have to do that, right? So if I see a car driving by, I can still produce an intention to alter my perception and think of something else, something totally random. I can be thinking about food instead of looking at the car. However, like I said, if I do that, if more of my attention goes into my mind and less into the external reality, then I'm going to tune out what's going on with the car. It's going to be harder to have thoughts about it and understand what's going on with it. Right? So if you're focused on the environment around you, like strongly focused, then the concrete command component is generally going to express what you're observing. So like I said, usually when you're very focused on the environment around you, you're both physically sensing the environment, but you're also imagining the environment at the same time, right? Now for the abstract component, that's a little different because that one you don't get for free for your five senses. And as an example, let's say you see two people arguing, right? Your command, the abstract command component of your attention may express itself in the form of a relationship that says, okay, if it looks to you like these two people are arguing, you might say they're upset with each other. You could say they're strangers. The relationship could be that they're strangers, that they're enemies, or something, right? And then you'll feel a negative feeling, right? Now, the abstract component is much looser in that, compared to the concrete component, in that it may or may not be correct, right? And you've probably experienced this many times, right? So let's say you see two people arguing, or it looks like they're arguing to you. Then you find out they're laughing and they were actually, playing or something. I don't know. They were pretending. And you see that they're good friends. And you're like, oh, so your concrete command component was wrong, right? In its interpretation of what happened, right? Maybe someone's done something to offend you in some way. And you get upset. And then you learn later, like, oh, they weren't offending you. They were doing something else that was completely different from what you were thinking. So the abstract command component of your intention was wrong. So But this ties into exactly what I said. The conscious mind is always trying to make sense of what's happening in the environment around it. The concrete component, that just comes from your five senses, so that's usually pretty easy. You don't, like if I see a car, let's say I see a green car, I'm not going to produce a concrete command to imagine that car red instead. It makes no sense. I could do it, but it's unnecessary mental work for me. I'd have to go out of my way to do that. The natural tendency is to just copy whatever my five senses are feeding me. But for the abstract component, it's more of a intuitive or investigative sort of feel to it, right? Or investigative sort of situation. Because your five senses are going to give you information about the relationship between different things. You got to kind of figure it out yourself. And so the abstract command component could be different, right? It could be multiple different things. As your attention is on the situation and you have a tendency to make sense of what's going on, which is natural for us to do in order to interact safely with our environment, you're going to constantly produce an abstract command component that reflects what you think is happening, right? So that's the reflection principle. So, and that's basically what I mean by context. So your conscious mind is always producing an intention, or has a tendency. It's not a strong, hard rule like it absolutely has to, but as a tendency. It usually will do this, right? It'll usually produce an intention that pretty much just copies what it's seeing. If you see two people fighting, right, if it looks like they're fighting to you, you're going to produce an intention that alters your perception to imagine exactly what the two people physically look like according to your five senses, what they sound like, but also you're going to your perception is going to be altered to perceive a relationship and even a background history, because information and history is also part of the abstract command component of intention. So you may see all of that, and you may just start putting all types of things may be coming into your head, right, about what's going on and what's happening and things like that. So that's basically the reflection principle in a nutshell. So why this is important, right, is because when you combine the attention principle, which is basically that you have to think something, you can't think something that your attention isn't on, right? And you pretty much have to think something based on what you're paying attention to, put it another way. And combining that with the reflection principle, which your intention tends to copy or reflect what you're observing. If you combine those two, well, if you also combine the principle, like we said before, that you can't turn your conscious and subconscious mind off, your subconscious is pretty much going to charge based on what you're observing, then you're going to realize that the more you focus on external things, if external things organize themselves in particular ways and present themselves to you in particular ways, as long as your attention is on them, they're going to cause your subconscious to charge up in a certain way. That basically is the entire theory of entertainment and how entertainment works. So again, we're going to go more into that in the next video, but just kind of think about these principles, your attention principle, reflection principle, because these are going to be very important in terms of how the external world affects your subconscious activity. But we're going to go into more detail in a later chapter, in the next video, and then that's going to be very important spiritually too, when we get into the next book, in book 2. Right, so yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't think there was too much in this video, but yeah, these principles are important. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.